So if you've watched some of my other videos, you may think I'm not too fond of Ferrari. And while I may not be their biggest fan, I still have enormous respect for them as a team. And I've got to say, not seeing them fight at the front this season has been a bit weird. But while I do think they hold a bit too much bargaining power regarding decisions about the sport, there's no denying they deserve a fair bit of recognition being the oldest and most prestigious F1 team of all time. But if I were to choose one word to describe the state they are in now, prestigious certainly wouldn't be it. So what has happened to Ferrari this year? And when will they be back winning races and challenging for the title? Well, let's just begin by looking over how successful Ferrari are in the grand scheme of things. Well, firstly, they have 238 wins, 16 constructors titles, 768 podiums, and 228 pole positions. To put it simply, they are hands down the most successful team in Formula 1 history. But in fairness, they have been part of the sport pretty much since it began, so it is all relative. But when you think of Formula 1, you think of Ferrari, and it shows based on some of the drivers that have won races in their car. I'm talking Michael Schumacher, Juan Manuel Fangio, Niki Lauda, Fernando Alonso, Sebastian Vettel, Alain Prost. The list goes on and on and on. But to say it's been a breeze for all 1007 races would be quite far from the truth. They have had their fair share of hiccups over the years, and as we've seen this year, it can be a pretty ugly sight when they do. But that being said, they have picked the perfect year, because at 3 separate races, they've been able to go racing without the Tifosi booing them and calling for Mattia's head. But while this season has been an absolute nightmare, it's certainly not the first time they've found themselves in this situation. Let me just take you back to 1980, where Ferrari finished 10th in the standings, even below Emerson Fittipaldi's private team. And to make it worse, they even won the title with Jody Scheckter just the year before. But for some of the younger people that weren't alive then, myself included, one season you may remember was 2009. Well, just like 1980, they had come off the back of winning the Constructors' title, but they still only managed to finish 4th in the standings thanks to the surprisingly competitive Brawn and Red Bull teams. But having seen the shambles of this season, they would have given their right leg to finish 4th. So let's look back at the 2020 season and evaluate just how awful it's been for Ferrari. So if I were to rank Ferrari's worst seasons ever, I would put 2020 at second after only the horrendous 1980 season. And you may think this is a bit harsh, but looking back, there hasn't been another year where Ferrari have been so consistently slow and uncompetitive. To put it into numbers, Ferrari finished 2020 in 6th place on 131 points, with no race wins and only 3 podiums. But while their gap to Mercedes has closed over the length of the season, they still remain almost a second off the pace on average, with most of that time being lost on the straights. To put this massive loss of performance into context, here is the 2020 season compared to 2019. Well, firstly, Ferrari finished second in the standings on 504 points compared to this year's 131. But the statistic that shows just how far behind they are is podiums, and that's in a year where we've had 13 different podium finishes. Look, I'm not trying to rub this in with Ferrari fans, but what has caused such a massive drop in performance? Well, it started back in mid-2019 when the rival teams began to question how Ferrari had so much straight-line speed following the wins at the power-hungry Belgian and Italian Grand Prix. And a couple of months later at the US Grand Prix, the FIA said they would look into whether Ferrari had tricked the fuel sensor, which would allow them to use more fuel and gain more performance from the engine. Well, that weekend it seemed Ferrari had a sudden drop in pace compared to previous races, so rightly so, teams began to get very suspicious. Then earlier this year, the teams were pretty pissed off when the FIA reached a private settlement with Scuderia Ferrari. Basically, in short, Ferrari had broken the rules, and the FIA knew if this came out publicly, it would damage the sport's reputation because of how important Ferrari are. So basically, the FIA told Ferrari to stop infringing the fuel flow rules, which they did, and that is exactly why their engine is so slow this year. And because it was so close to the start of the season, they weren't able to adapt the engine and chassis, so when they arrived in Austria, it was a complete mess, as we all know. Well, to add insult to injury, they had designed their 2020 car around the faster powertrain, so all the aero on the car wasn't optimised for a much less powerful engine, and that's why they were losing time in the corners as well as the straights. Oh, and thanks to Ferrari pushing the rules, all the teams with Ferrari engines have been screwed over as well, but I guess it makes no difference to Kimi, seeing as F1 is just a hobby anyway. So that's why 2020 has been such a mess for Ferrari, but will 2021 bring much change? Well, most likely not, because the regulation changes only include the removal of some aero winglets here or there, so nothing that Ferrari can really capitalise on. If anything, it'll actually hurt Ferrari because they need to rely on aero because their engine is so crap. And on top of this, with 2022 coming fast, I have no doubt Ferrari will focus mainly on that, leaving 2021 to go down the drain. So basically, don't expect Ferrari to suddenly bounce back to their original self next year. But it's pretty clear to see that Ferrari's issues stretch beyond just a shoddy engine. The actual team could do with some changes in my opinion. Firstly, I'm going to address the issue of Ferrari's team principal and Harry Potter's long-lost father, Mattia Binotto. He's had 2 seasons at Ferrari, and so far everyone can agree they've only gone backwards, and here is why. Mattia Binotto is a brilliant technical mind, but hasn't yet shown that he's a capable leader, which is what a team principal needs to be. You can see by how he handled the Vettel situation that he's not quite up to scratch, as of yet. I am by no means saying he won't become a good leader in the future, and as we've seen in the past, Ferrari don't shy away when sacking team bosses, so the pressure's on for Binotto. Now, looking at the team in general, one area which they need to be more aware and welcoming of is a more diverse group of people, especially in management. I'm sure if you look at the list of all the Ferrari employees, the majority are Italian, and I by no means have an issue with Italians. What I'm getting at is bringing in people from different countries and environments would breathe new life into the team and maybe show that there are better ways of doing things. And this concept isn't new to Ferrari. In the early 2000s, they had a French team boss, English technical director, South African chief designer, Greek head of aerodynamics, and of course a German driver. And if I remember correctly, they had some decent success. And while they are moving in the right direction with the current sporting director, Laurent Mekies, being French, there's no denying they could be doing more. Interestingly though, arguably the most significant thing Binotto has done as team principal is change how the team is structured. Basically meaning before there wasn't much of a chain of command with the managers etc, so if something went wrong, it was hard to blame one person. What Binotto has done is change this into a clear chain of command, so if something does go wrong, it's easy to see what and who to blame, etc, etc. Now, Binotto thinks doing this will stop issues falling through the cracks, and I'd agree with him, but Ferrari isn't really normal because of the intense pressure the job holds due to the scathing Italian media. So you may see the managers not wanting to take much risk in the future, but that remains to be seen. So with all this in mind, let's answer the main question of this video. When will Ferrari return to winning ways? Well, let's first look back to 1980 and 2009 to see how quickly Ferrari bounced back in those years. Well, in 1980 it took them 2 years to return to a title-winning team, versus only 1 year in 2009 when Alonso challenged for the title in 2010. So we can expect Ferrari to bounce back at least by 2022, right? Well, it's really not that simple, because the sport as a whole is in a very different situation this time round. What I'm referring to is the 2021 budget cap and the 2022 regulations. I've covered how I think they will affect other teams like McLaren, Aston Martin and Mercedes, but Ferrari's situation is quite unique. Basically in the past, whenever Ferrari have had a difficult season, they've been able to bounce back because of their enormous budget compared to other teams that don't really have that luxury. Well, what this means with the budget cap is Ferrari is probably going to struggle to bounce back like they usually do because they will be restricted financially. And it's looking like the technical regulations aren't going to work in their favour too much either, due to how aerodynamically simple the cars will be. So if Ferrari still aren't on top of their engine issues come 2022, they'll have less aerodynamic freedom to gain back that time lost from the engine. Now, in my opinion, the single most important thing for Ferrari at the moment is getting on top of their team management and business philosophy. If Binotto's new team structure I was talking about before works perfectly, then I don't see the new regs being such a problem, because they'll be able to work around it efficiently, much like Mercedes will. But this obviously includes having a team leader at the helm that brings people together towards the same goal. And for all I know, Binotto could be that guy. Time will tell. And as I've mentioned before, I do really think that adopting a more diverse group of people at the team will pay massive dividends. But knowing Ferrari, this probably won't happen very quickly, if at all. Now, this brings me on to a topic I somehow haven't addressed all video, and that's the driver lineup of Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. Well, the reason I haven't brought it up is because I don't think Ferrari need to worry one bit about their drivers. Firstly, Charles Leclerc, as we all know, is an incredible talent, and has been outdriving that SF1000 all season. And thanks to him being only 23 years old, Ferrari know they can build their team around him for the long term, much like they did with Schumacher. And they also have the perfect driver to accompany him in Carlos Sainz Jr. Now, Carlos is a brilliant driver, but I don't think he's quite at the same level as Charles, which is actually perfect for Ferrari because he'll be fighting occasionally with Leclerc, but not so much that issues arise like they did with Vettel and Leclerc in 2019, because we all know how well Ferrari handled that situation. Okay, so to round it all up, I see 2021 as a dead loss for Ferrari. The carryover of regulations mean they are stuck with what they have now. So instead, I think they should use 2021 to get to grips with their new management structure and driver lineup. So when 2022 comes along, they have a well-designed car and a couple of brilliant drivers who can hit the ground running. And in terms of the budget cap, once they have a business philosophy that works without the needs of hundreds of millions of euros, the budget cap shouldn't prove to be such an issue. But that being said, 2022 will be seriously competitive, with teams such as McLaren, Aston Martin, and possibly Alpine on the rise. But after all, Ferrari will bounce back and win races again. They're Ferrari, for God's sake. It's more a matter of when they will, rather than will they at all. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments section below when you think Ferrari will return to winning ways, and as always, make sure to like, subscribe, and smash that notification bell to be reminded of any new videos.